The day my daughter made me feel like a burden was the day I turned 68. Not a metaphorical burden, not the quiet sense that I was in the way. I mean, she sat across from me at my own kitchen table. The table I built with my own hands back in 1987, the one with a small burn mark near the left corner from when my wife set down a hot casserole dish without a trivet, and she told me that I was dragging the family down. Those were her exact words. Dragging the family down. I had just finished blowing out the candles on a grocery store cake my son-in-law picked up last minute. The frosting was too sweet, the kind that leaves a film on your teeth. My grandson, little Marcus, was still clapping, because he loved any excuse to clap, and my daughter, my Rebecca, was already clearing plates before anyone had finished eating, her jaw tight, her movements sharp. I knew that look. I'd known it for 2 years by then. But I still wasn't prepared for what came next. She said they needed to talk to me about the arrangement. I remember thinking, what arrangement? I live here. This is my house. I paid off this mortgage in 2009. My wife and I raised 2 children between these walls. My wife, Carol, passed away from pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2019, and after the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the phone calls got less frequent, Rebecca had suggested, gently, at first, that she and her husband move in to help me manage things. I was 66. I had a bad hip. I missed Carol every single morning. I said yes. That was my first mistake, I suppose. But how do you know something is a mistake when it's your own child offering help? The arrangement, as Rebecca put it that evening, was that the house needed to be transitioned. She used that word 3 times. Transitioned. Like the house was a patient in a hospital, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a man sitting at his own table trying to swallow grocery store cake. Her husband Glenn didn't say much. He rarely did when Rebecca had already made up her mind about something. He just sat there with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking at the table. At one point I thought I saw him glance at me with something like apology in his eyes, but it passed so quickly I couldn't be sure. Rebecca explained that they had found a place for me. She called it a senior living community. She had a brochure. She actually pulled out a brochure from somewhere. I don't know where she was keeping it, her purse maybe, or the pocket of her jacket, and she slid it across the table toward me like we were in a business meeting. The place was called Meadowcrest. It was 40 minutes outside of Portland, Oregon, where we lived. The pictures showed smiling elderly people playing cards and walking through gardens. I looked at the brochure. I looked at my daughter. I said, "Rebecca, this is my house." She said, "Dad, we've been managing everything for 2 years. The bills, the yard, the repairs, it's a lot." I said, "I can manage my own bills." She said, "You forgot to pay the property taxes last March." That one landed. She was right about that. I had missed the payment. I was in a dark stretch that spring. The 2nd anniversary of losing Carol, combined with a health scare that turned out to be nothing but felt like everything for 3 weeks. I missed the payment, and she had covered it. I knew I owed her for that, but I didn't think it meant I owed her my home. The conversation went around in circles for a while, the way conversations do when one person has already made a decision and the other person is still under the impression that they're having a discussion. By the end of the night, nothing was resolved. Rebecca said she'd give me some time to think it over. She said Meadowcrest had a spot opening up in 6 weeks. I went to bed that night, in my own bedroom, in the house where I had lived for 31 years, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I want to be honest here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. Part of me understood where Rebecca was coming from. I wasn't the man I used to be physically. The hip was getting worse. Some days I didn't leave the house. Some days I ate cereal for dinner because I didn't feel like cooking. I knew I had been relying on her more than I wanted to admit. I knew that grief had made me smaller in ways I hadn't fully reckoned with. But understanding someone's frustration and agreeing to be discarded are 2 very different things. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the house changed in ways that are hard to describe, but impossible to miss if you've ever lived through something similar. Rebecca started labeling things in the kitchen, not dramatically, not with big signs, but little labels in her handwriting on the shelves. Her section, Glenn's section, My groceries got moved to the bottom shelf of the pantry without any explanation. The thermostat got locked to a temperature that she preferred, and when I tried to adjust it, she left a note on the control panel saying to please leave the settings alone. I started spending more time in my workshop in the garage. I had always loved woodworking. It was how I unwound after 30 years working as a civil engineer for the county. The garage was the one place that still felt entirely mine. My tools on my pegboard, Carol's old radio on the shelf, the smell of cedar and sawdust that I had loved since I was a young man, watching my own father work with his hands. One afternoon I came inside from the garage and found a real estate agent sitting in my living room with Rebecca and Glenn. They were looking at papers spread across the coffee table. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Nobody said anything. Rebecca looked up. She said, "Dad, we were going to talk to you about this. Come sit down." I said, "What is this?" The agent, a young woman I had never met, started shuffling her papers like they were evidence at a trial. Glenn got up and went to the kitchen. Rebecca told me they had been looking into the market value of the property. She said that if the house was sold, there would be enough to cover Meadow Crest for many years, with money left over. I said, "It's not for sale." Rebecca said, "Dad, please don't be emotional about this." That phrase, "don't be emotional," as if the correct response to finding a stranger in your living room discussing the sale of your home, without your knowledge, without your consent, was to sit down calmly and review the comparable listings. I asked the agent to leave. She left. Rebecca and I had the worst argument we had ever had, worse than anything from her teenage years, worse than the disagreements we'd had after Carol passed about how to handle the estate. She said I was being selfish. She said I was refusing to see what was best for everyone. She said that at my age, alone, with a deteriorating hip and no one to look after me, I was a liability. A liability. A liability. Her word. I went back to the garage. I sat on my workbench and I looked at Carol's radio for a long time. I thought about calling my son, Patrick, who lived in Denver. Patrick and Rebecca had never been particularly close, and he and Rebecca had drifted further since Carol passed. We talked on the phone a few times a month. He knew things were tense with Rebecca, but I don't think he understood how far it had gone. I picked up my phone and put it down. I wasn't ready to make it real by saying it out loud to someone else. What I did instead was something I hadn't done in months. I called my oldest friend, a man named Vincent, who I had known since we were both 24 years old, working for the same engineering firm in Portland. 44 years of friendship. He had been at my wedding. I had been at his 2 weddings, the first one and the better one. He had flown back from his retirement in Tucson when Carol died and sat with me in that hospital room, and then at the kitchen table afterward and didn't say anything, just stayed. That's the kind of friendship you can't manufacture. Vincent had taken a position 3 years ago as the administrative director of a senior care facility on the west side of Portland. He had done it partly because his own mother had had a terrible experience in a poorly managed facility, and he wanted to understand the industry from the inside. He was good at it. He told me once that the work mattered to him in a way he hadn't expected. I told Vincent what was happening, all of it. The brochure, the labels on the kitchen shelves, the real estate agent in the living room. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his great qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ray, I need you to do something for me." I said, "What?" He said, "I need you to talk to a lawyer before you do anything else." I said I didn't have a lawyer. He said he knew one. His name was Hal, a semi-retired attorney who specialized in elder law and estate planning. Vincent had worked with him on several cases involving seniors whose rights had been violated by family members managing their affairs. He said Hal was the best person he knew for exactly this kind of situation. I met with Hal 2 days later. I drove myself, which felt important. I sat across from him in a small office that smelled like old books, and told him everything. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. He asked good questions. He didn't seem surprised by anything I told him, which I found both reassuring and a little sad. It meant he'd heard stories like mine before. Hal explained several things to me that I hadn't fully understood about my own situation. The house was in my name. Only my name. Carol and I had kept it that way for estate planning reasons years ago, and it had never been changed. Rebecca had no legal authority to sell it, list it, or make any decisions about it without my signature. No one had forged anything. No one had forged anything. No one had stolen power of attorney. What was happening was a form of pressure, sustained, deliberate, orchestrated pressure, intended to wear me down until I agreed to sign. He also told me something else. He said that based on what I had described, the labeling of spaces, the locked thermostat, the exclusion from decisions about my own property, there was a credible argument that I was being subjected to elder financial abuse, which in Oregon is a legal matter, not just a family dispute. I drove home from that meeting a different man than the one who had driven there. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I don't want it to sound like revenge. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. When you've been slowly made to feel like a ghost in your own house, like your opinions are a nuisance and your presence is a burden and your grief is an inconvenience, when that has been your daily reality for months, having someone sit across from you and confirm that you are legally, factually, entirely within your rights to say no changes, something fundamental in how you carry yourself. I went home. I was calm. Rebecca was in the kitchen making dinner. I sat down at my kitchen table, the one I built, and I told her that I had spoken with a lawyer and that I would not be signing anything related to the house, that I would not be moving to Meadowcrest or anywhere else, and that if any further steps were taken to pressure me, I would be pursuing the matter through the appropriate legal channels. She stared at me. I said, "I'd like my shelf space in the pantry back." The next few weeks were cold. That's the only word for it. Rebecca and Glenn barely spoke to me. Meals were separate. The garage became my sanctuary even more than before. I started a new project out there, a rocking chair I had been meaning to build for years, the kind with curved oak rails that my grandfather used to have on his porch in Vermont. Working with my hands had always been the thing that kept me tethered when everything else felt like it was sliding. Vincent called to check on me regularly. He had spoken with Hal as well, and they were both keeping an eye on the situation. He never made me feel like a case to be managed. He just called and talked to me the way he always had, about the blazers, about the weather, about the rocking chair. Normal things. It mattered more than I can explain. About 5 weeks after my meeting with Hal, Rebecca told me she and Glenn had found an apartment. She said it flatly over breakfast, without looking up from her phone. She said they would be out by the end of the month. I said, "Okay." She looked up then. I think she expected something different from me, relief maybe, or protest, or some kind of emotional display she could use as evidence that I was unstable. I didn't give her any of it. I just said okay and finished my coffee. The day they moved out, Glenn shook my hand at the door. It was a real handshake, firm and brief. He looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Ray. I should have said more." I nodded. I believed him. Rebecca hugged me at the end, which surprised me. It was stiff and short, the hug of someone who is angry and sorry at the same time. I hugged her back. She is still my daughter. That doesn't go away. Nothing about this story ends with me not loving my daughter. It's just more complicated now, and probably will be for a long time, and I've made my peace with that. The apartment they moved into was 20 minutes away. A few weeks after the move, I removed all the labels from the pantry shelves. I adjusted the thermostat to 69 degrees, which is what Carol always kept it at. I bought a plant for the kitchen windowsill, something I hadn't done in 2 years because Rebecca was allergic. I finished the rocking chair in November. It took me 3 weeks longer than I expected because I kept adjusting the curve of the rails until they felt exactly right. Vincent came over for dinner the night I finished it, and we sat on the back porch with it and a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir and talked until almost midnight. He told me about a woman from his facility whose family had done something similar to her. Not identical, but similar, and how it had ended well for her too. I told him I wasn't sure what ended well meant for me yet. He said that was a reasonable thing to say. My phone tells me Rebecca has called 41 times since the move. Not all at once, spread across weeks. Some out of what I believe is genuine worry. Some out of frustration. Some probably just habit. I've answered about half of them. The conversations are brief and careful, like two people who've agreed not to step on the same ground that cracked before. We're working on it. That's the most honest thing I can say. The rocking chair is on my back porch now. Every morning I take my coffee out there and sit in it and look at the yard. The old oak tree that's been there since before I bought the house. The garden beds I let go to seed that I'm slowly bringing back. The fence that needs one more coat of paint before winter. My hip still hurts. I still miss Carol every single morning. Some days I still eat cereal for dinner. But I sit in that chair and I think about what Hal said to me when I asked him whether I should feel guilty for pushing back against my own daughter. He said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "A man who knows his rights and exercises them quietly isn't causing conflict. He's refusing to participate in his own erasure. Refusing to participate in my own erasure." I wrote that down when I got home. I still have the piece of paper. It's on the workbench in the garage, held down by a can of wood stain. And sometimes when I'm out there working and the radio is playing and the sawdust is in the air, I look at it and I think that's the most important thing anyone has said to me in a long time. I'm 68 years old. I built this table. I own this house. I'm not going anywhere. I've been sitting in that rocking chair a lot lately, thinking about how quietly things can go wrong before you even realize they've started. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to be a villain in this story. Not even Rebecca. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with, and I think it's the part that matters most if you're going to take anything useful away from what happened to me. What I've come to understand is that the way people treat you is almost always a reflection of what they believe you're capable of. Rebecca started treating me like a problem to be solved the moment she decided, somewhere deep down, that I had stopped being a man who could push back. She didn't do it all at once. It was gradual. A label here, a locked thermostat there. A brochure slid across a table like I was already someone else's responsibility. Each small thing was a test, and each time I said nothing, the next thing got a little bigger. That's how erosion works. It's not one flood, it's 1,000 quiet mornings of water finding the same crack. The phone call I made to Vincent didn't save me. I want to be clear about that. What saved me was making it. There's a difference. The moment I picked up that phone, I was already deciding that my own story wasn't finished. Vincent and Hal gave me tools and information, but the decision to use them, that came from inside a garage, sitting on a workbench looking at Carol's radio, choosing not to disappear quietly. I think about the rocking chair a lot in that context too. I built it when everything was most uncertain. I didn't know how things would resolve. Rebecca and Glenn were still in the house. The atmosphere was cold, and I had no guarantee that a letter from Hal would be enough to change the trajectory of what was happening. But I went out to the garage every day, and I worked on those curved oak rails until they were exactly right. Not because I was escaping, because making something well with your own hands in the middle of difficulty is one of the most honest things a person can do. It keeps you tethered to who you actually are when everything around you is trying to convince you that you're someone smaller. That's the thing about dignity. It's not a feeling. It's a practice. It's what you do with your hands and your time when you could just as easily fold. I'm not angry at Rebecca. Anger would require me to believe she knew exactly what she was doing to me, and I don't think she did. I think she was overwhelmed and impatient and not nearly as equipped to handle grief. Her mother's death, my fragility, her own fear of what aging looks like up close, as she believed she was. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it, and explanation is where you have to start if you want any kind of future with the people who hurt you. She calls. I answer about half the time. We're careful with each other. That's not nothing. What I know now, at 68, is that the people who try to make themselves indispensable to you, who move into your house and manage your bills and slowly rearrange your shelves, are not always doing it out of love. Sometimes they are. Sometimes it's both. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is know the difference, and know your own name, and know where your tools are, and go out to the garage and build something that will outlast the argument. The chair is solid. The rails are exactly right. Every morning I take my coffee out there, and I sit in it and I think, I'm still here. That's enough.